I'm going to start by talking about festivals in the Greek world, but I thought we ought to start by thinking about why in the ancient world you have festivals at all. It's important to realize that in the Greek world, there aren't any weekends because there aren't any weeks. So the only thing that breaks up your work time is religious festivals. The Greek world didn't have any birthdays. Not quite true in the Roman world, but in the Greek world, no one celebrates their birthday. So it was only going and celebrating some god or other that got you out of a day's work. It got you into a wonderful meat meal. The whole point of sacrifice, or at least one of the points of sacrifice, is that you get some meat. So festivals need to happen regularly throughout the year so that you get properly fed. But the character of the festival obviously changes according to the season. And it changes for these reasons. Here you've got the weather in Athens. So as you can see here from the top graph, the temperature in December is not great, even in Athens, about 10 degrees. And the rainfall is as heavy as it ever gets. You can see that December is the month with maximum rain on bottom left, and the minimum sun on the bottom right. So your winter festival in Athens needs to be a festival where you're doing things that are going to keep you warm, at least to some extent. What you do about the rain is a bit uncertain. Alternatively, of course, you could go indoors. So when we go to Rome, the Saturnalia, is that right, Mary, happens indoors as well as out?
Yeah, I mean, most of it probably actually happens indoors, or at least the bits we know about happen indoors. That's different.
Yeah. But in Athens, the festivals that we get in the middle of the winter are outdoor festivals like all the rest. So we know roughly, not always precisely, but roughly when most festivals at Athens happen. And we can trace a whole lot of festivals through the winter months. So the months of Poseidaon, named after the god Poseidon, and which more or less corresponds to our December. Gamalion, our January, Anthesterion, our February, and Alephagolion, our March. In December, we get the festival called the Rural Dionysia, and that's what I'm going to talk most about today. And also a festival called the Haloa. The Haloa happens only at Eleusis within the region of Attica, and seems to have involved having an absolutely massive bonfire. One of the few things we know about it is that they bought 3 tons of firewood in order to have a bonfire. And you can see from what I've said about temperature, about why that might be the case. So that's their local solution to what you do in the winter. You have a big bonfire. In January, you get the festival of Linaea, another festival of Dionysus, and another festival which has drama attached to it. In February, you get the Anthesteria. Part of what you do at the Anthesteria is open the new wine. So that's an alternative way in which you keep yourself warm, I guess. And then in March, you get the city Dionysia, where again, you're watching plays. So one of the really interesting things is, despite the cold temperature, the Athenians put themselves through long periods watching drama at the city Dionysia and at the Linaea. Presumably, they preferred to do that and be slightly chilly than be absolutely baked to cinder and doing it in the sun in the summer. But the Rural Dionysia happens not just in Athens itself, but happens all over Attica. So you've got a map of the Athens here. There's an A on the map marking where Athens itself is. And then all these other little names are the names of villages in Attica. And my strange symbols, meant to be rings, some of them rather oval and some of them round, show places we know to have had theatres outside Athens. And the presence of a theatre is one fairly sure sign that that village was celebrating the Rural Dionysia. We don't think that all villages celebrated the Rural Dionysia, but on the whole, the larger villages probably celebrated the Rural Dionysia. As you can see, the theatres we know about are pretty unevenly distributed, but it may well be that there are more theatres to be found. Some of these theatres are quite fun in their own right. The earliest of them, which you see here, so on the left-hand side, you're looking vertically down at this theatre, and you can immediately see that it's not the circular shape that you're familiar with from ancient theatres. It's much more rectangular in terms of its stage, with this long, slightly curving set of seating. And it's a massive construction. So on the right, you've got the supporting wall at the right-hand end, as it were, of the theatre as you look at it. This is from the village of Thorikos, which is down near the tip of Attica, and was a mining village. And you can see various mining works around it. Industrial action, residence, burial. There was a cemetery right in front of the theatre, and the theatrical action all happened cheek by jowl at Thorikos. Here's a rather different setting, also in Attica, a place called Ikarion. This is the place where Dionysus is supposed to have first turned up in Attica. And you can see here the remains of bits of seating and other monuments associated with the ancient theatre there. This is the most recently discovered of Athenian theatres, the village that was in antiquity called Acharnae and is now called Acharnae again. So it's the biggest of all Athenian villages in antiquity. And here you can see this does seem to have taken the pretty classic theatrical form. This is probably built in the 4th century, whereas the Thorikos theatre was built at the end of the 6th century. And we've had just a bit of it excavated in the past couple of decades. And then here, you can see the urban setting of this from the buildings around. Here we are in the port of Athens, the Piraeus, another 4th century theatre of more or less classic form. So the Athenians had put considerable investment into making really substantial theatres across the whole of Attica in order to hold the Rural Dionysia. So what happened at this festival? We mainly know about it, or at least our best impression of what happens, comes from a parody of it that we get from Aristophanes' first comedy, the Acharnians, performed in 425 BC. And we'll look at that in a moment. What that describes is a procession, and that procession leads to a sacrifice. And then what we know to have followed, though we don't get to this in the Acharnians, are a whole lot of agones, of competitions, drama, sometimes tragedy and comedy, we think, sometimes perhaps just comedy. Then a sort of sport, which was riding on top of greasy wineskins. So this was a sort of impossible task that you just presumably watched lots of people failing to do. But we're also told about something called askoliasmos, which seems to be hopping on one leg. Not quite clear whether this is 3-legged races or just hopping races. And we think there probably was cockfighting as well. But this was also made into a sort of general village get-together, which the village celebrated and chose to celebrate in particular its local benefactors. So if you'd done something really good for your village during the year, your name would be called out on this occasion, presumably because this is the occasion when most of the village turns out in order to have a fun time. And I guess all these aspects, the procession, the sacrifice, and the cooking of meat that will go on from the sacrifice, and then these very active bits of competition, they're all in part about just doing things in this festival that keeps you warm, not just sitting around. So here is the little bit of text from Aristophanes in which the comic hero of the Acharnians, a man called Dionysus, Mr. Just City, sets up a sort of rural Dionysia in order to celebrate the fact that he's just made peace. So Acharnians is a play put on in the Peloponnesian War. It's a play that's all about the desire for peace. And Dionysus, if he can't persuade the city to make peace as a whole, will just make peace himself so that he can get back to normal life. And his sign of normal life is to get back to the Dionysia. So he starts by calling for silence, and then he calls the basket bearer to advance forward. His daughter is playing the part of a basket bearer, so this is the religious procession. And he calls on his slave, Xanthias, to come in holding a phallus. Hold the phallus well upright. And I'll talk a bit more about processions of phalli in a moment. Then he gets the daughter to set down the basket so they can start the sacrifice. And then he prays to Lord Dionysus. "O Lord Dionysus, joyfully freed from military duties and my household slaves, I perform this solemn procession and offer you this sacrifice. Grant that I may keep the rural Dionysia without hindrance, and that this truce of 30 years may be propitious for me. Come, my child, carry the basket gracefully and with a face like someone chewing thyme." I think this is supposed to be not a sort of smiley face, but a serious face. "Happy he who shall marry you and cuddle you so firmly at dawn that you fart like a weasel. On you go, take great care no one snatches your jewels in the crowd. Xanthias, hold the phallus well erect behind the basket bearer." You've got Aristophanes, having already made the joke about holding the phallus erect once, is now making the joke again. Why waste a good joke? "I will follow, singing the Phallic hymn, and you, wife, look on from the roof." And then he prays again, "Phalles, companion of Bacchic rites, night reveler of adultery and pederasty, god of adultery and pederasty, these past 6 years I've not been able to invoke you. With what joy I return to the village, thanks to the truce I've concluded, freed from cares, from battles, and from Lamachus. Lamachus is a famous general from the Peloponnesian War. How much sweeter, O Phalles, Phalles, it is to surprise Thrata, the pretty wood maid, Strymodorus' slave, stealing wood from Mount Phelus, to catch her under the arms, to throw her down and trombone her, O Phalles, Phalles." So his idea of fun is evidently the rape of his neighbour's servant. There's an aspect of Athenian comedy which is not that attractive. "If you'll drink and amuse yourself with me, we shall tomorrow, after our hangover, consume some good dish in honour of the peace, and I'll hang up my shield over the smoking hearth." So we have here a little model of what the rural Dionysia was like. You got this procession. This procession featured basket bearers, all the stuff you need for a sacrifice, but it also featured people processing with phallus poles. Now, what exactly a procession of phallus poles looked like, we don't really know. Scholars who talk about it always use this pot to show what a phallus pole is like. And indeed, on the basis of this, they calculate that phallus poles needed lots of people to help carry them. So one of my solemn colleagues managed to calculate that for the city Dionysia, where we know that all Athens' allies were supposed to turn up with Phalli, he calculated that there would be 200 allies, and that each of these phallus poles needed 15 men to carry it. And therefore, there were 3,000 people in the phallus pole procession at the city Dionysia. I think we might be a little bit more skeptical about whether you need 15 people or whether this pot quite shows you what a phallus pole looks like. But it probably does give you some idea that what a phallus pole was a very large pole decorated at one end to make it look at least vaguely phallus-like. Here, as you can see, the phallus pole is being ridden by this enormous satyr, who is himself then being ridden by somebody who is carrying a great drinking horn. But it is important to remember the phallus pole, because the phallus pole reminds us that these Dionysiac rites were not all about being terribly solemn and getting terribly serious about tragedy. They were also about buffoonery, and that the slapstick humor and obscenity that we associate with old comedy is actually a fundamental part of what's going on. When it comes to riding the greasy wine skin, we haven't got any good images at all, really. The closest we can come up with is this, which again notably shows not a human but a satyr. So these half horse, half men creatures that always display their greed for alcohol and their sexual excitement. Here you've got a pretty typical satyr, again holding a slightly wonky drinking horn and sitting on top of a wine skin. Whether this is supposed to be a greasy wineskin or not, I'm not sure. But I think the idea of these wineskins is that you inflate them and seal them up. So they're a sort of bouncy device. And you then attempt to make your way bouncing across on this greasy wineskin, which is presumably a more or less impossible task. So there's plenty of ways to warm up and amuse yourself at the Rural Dionysia, as well as more serious entertainment. Now, the Rural Dionysia seems in fact to have been the earliest festival of Dionysus and to have come before the city Dionysia. So the Dionysia in the city is a sort of city version of the Rural Dionysia. As you saw from my calendar earlier, happens a couple of months later, when it's getting slightly warmer and the weather is a little bit more reliable, and when people can sit through 4 plays in succession without freezing. What exactly happened at the Rural Dionysia in the 6th century, we don't know. We don't know at what point plays become an important part of Dionysiac competition. But it's possible that actually they develop out of choral activity of a different sort. And we've got these rather mysterious pots from the 6th century from Athens, which show what look like probably choruses in as far as they show lots of people doing the same thing, but which don't seem to correspond to a myth or whatever. They don't seem to be actors playing anything in particular out. They just seem to be dressing up for the fun of it, or playing some sort of game for the fun of it, whether in costume and on stilts, on the left-hand side here, or riding each other, as you see on the right-hand side here. And it may be that aspects of sort of coordinated activity of this sort were what you had at the Rural Dionysia in the 6th century before the development of tragedy and comedy performed there in the 5th. As I said, these are also the occasion when the whole community gets together and celebrates its benefactors. But actually, some of those benefactors were required in order to pay to put on the Dionysia in the first place. And here you've got a little decree from the Deme of Ixone, which is just south of Athens, where you can see from the decoration, those 4 masks across the top, that this has something to do with the Rural Dionysia. So this is a decree thanking some people for putting in the money to put on these plays. And this is quite a fun little stele, in as far as you've got those very typical, slightly grotesque comic masks across the top. It looks as if this is a deme which may only have had put on comedy. There's no sign that they put on tragedy. All the comments are about comedies. Although if you look at the scene below the masks, then you've got a figure who seems to be Dionysus. So he's wearing his crown of leaves and he's holding out a little cantharos. But in front of him is a figure with a tail. So this looks like somebody who is dressed up as a satyr, implying perhaps that this was satyr play put on at the same time as comedies are put on. Or maybe this is a comedy which simply had a satyr as a character. But this is a nice way of reminding ourselves of all the aspects really of this event together. The drinking, I haven't put much emphasis on the drinking yet, but we saw it in Aristophanes' description. He was expecting to end up with a hangover. The drinking, the drama, the community coming together and honouring its benefactors, the community giving the chance for rich people within that community an opportunity to show off and use their wealth, but also having an enormous chance just to let their hair down, to take advantage of the fact that the weather's a bit cooler and they have plenty of energy, and get rid of that energy by dancing around with their phallus poles and on their greasy wineskins. So that's how you celebrate winter in Athens. How about Rome? Mary, over to you.
Okay, will you take your screen off? That's great. Well, I know this isn't a competition, but I think I am going to claim sort of that the Romans had more fun than the Athenians, actually. They didn't have phallus poles, but they're a bit more approachable in some ways. And you can see what they're having fun about, right? Not trying to ride greasy skins. I'm going to just talk briefly about the Roman festival of Saturnalia, which happens in December, and it is one of Robin's winter festivals. I think it's also probably the ancient festival that if you've heard of any, at least in Rome, the one you'll have heard of is the Saturnalia, because it's part of that phrase which says, do you know, Christmas, celebrations of Christmas, they go back actually to pagan celebrations, and there's the Roman festival of Saturnalia at the same time, right? So it's kind of become, within a broader sort of culture, as the place where our celebration of Christmas kind of started. And I want to say this evening that that's both true in a way, and also not true in a way, and that it is both a huge amount of fun, this celebration, but it also has its nastier sides. Now, I think that there's rather less information about it than what Robin's been able to give us for Athens. Had I got a PowerPoint, I could give you one 4th century image of apparently someone celebrating the Saturnalia, but there's not much else that I could show you. And I think, like many Roman festivals, what people who've worked on them have tried to do and trying to think what's going on, or actually literally what happened, is piece together little bits and little scraps of information from here and there, try to build up a picture. I mean, there is absolutely no full description in ancient Roman literature of what happened at the Saturnalia. There are lots of references to it, but nobody sits down and tells us how it was celebrated or how it might have been celebrated from start to finish. We're very much in the world, and I'll come to why in a minute, we're very much in the world, though, of the sense that this is midwinter, and there is a kind of exuberant sort of celebration going on in the city of Rome. It didn't happen outside the city of Rome. I think most Roman festivals, they don't follow the empire. They do a little bit, but by and large, it's very tied to the city. So what I'm talking about, the city of Rome, and it is, and this is why people compare it and try to see it as almost the origins of Christmas. It has various things which look familiar to us. We know, for example, that people gave each other presents at the Saturnalia. Now, it wasn't quite the sort of commercial blowout that we're used to. And you can go, if you like, and you can easily find it via Google, you can go to the little epigrams of Marshall. And in one of his books, he has a whole series of very short poems which accompany the presents you might give at the Saturnalia. And they're things like nuts and fruit. They're not not the latest consumer durable. So presents get exchanged at this ceremony, but they're rather modest ones. What we also know, what we're also told, is that a lot of gambling takes place, a lot of alcohol consumption takes place, and there is part of it which always rings true with a kind of modern office party, that it was the day on which the slaves sat down to dinner and the masters served them, or that is what is said. And it's, I mean, you can see how you match that up. And to some extent, we've probably imposed a bit of our own version of what happens at Christmas on the Saturnalia, but not hugely misleading. And you can find all kinds of characters around this midwinter festival who do things which very much fit with our modern reactions to Christmas. I mean, Pliny the Younger, writing one of his letters in the early 2nd century CE, I mean, he's becomes the traditional, predictable, grumpy old man at the Saturnalia. He said, "Oh God, the household is making a terrible raucous noise, but at least I can go off to my office and get some work done." Now, I've known men like that, and they existed 2,000 years ago. So that's about as far as familiarity goes. So the other aspect of familiarity is that this festival, as far as we can tell, it starts being a one-day festival just on what we would call the 17th of December. Over the centuries, it extends. It's a bit like Christmas. When I was a kid, what you do is Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and Boxing Day, and then it would be back to work. Now it's a whole damn week, or up to the 6th of January. Well, something the same is happening in Rome. It certainly extends till the 23rd of December, and maybe a bit later. The question, though, is, so what's it all about? right? And so we know some of those things that we're picking up from little asides, but it's much harder to say, what are they doing? Why are they celebrating it? And in fact, as often with Roman festivals, you find when you do get extended discussions of it in Roman writers, they're trying to work that out too, right? So it's not, it's part of what they see as very deep Roman tradition, but they're not quite sure what it all means. And that extends to, for example, just the identity of the god Saturn, who is at the center of the Saturnalia. Now, he's an old Roman deity. If you kind of look at his later mythology, he's thought to be the father of Jupiter. He's a kind of divine character who looks back to a golden age in the past, a golden age when of liberation, of the breaking down of human rules and regulations, a kind of carnivalesque character in a way, or that's one of the ways they see him. It's always very hard to pin these Roman deities or Greek deities down. I mean, the other thing that any Roman would have known about Saturn is that his temple in the Forum, the temple of Saturn, where some of this ritual takes place, that was also where the Romans stashed away their state treasury. So he was the banking god, as well as being the god of pleasure and letting it all hang out. It is quite hard to be certain, but I think what we can be clear about is that it is a festival, a bit, I suppose, like Christmas now, where there are some aspects of the festival happen in public, or sometimes in the open air, but at least in the temple of Saturn, and some happen much more. It's much more domestic. It's much more shut away. It's in front of the fire at the home. It's a bit hard to see what the public festivals amount to, but one of the things they do, don't ask me why, is that in the temple of Saturn, the image of the god Saturn that was in there had his feet tied together with wool. Now, on the festival day, on the 17th of December, they go and they take the wool bonds off the temple of the statue in the temple of Saturn. Now, it's easy to see why people have seen that as a kind of liberating move, that even the god is liberated by having his woolen ties removed. Whether that is true or not, I just don't know. But the usual idea is that we have this liberatory deity whose festival is also played out in a kind of liberation of the home, that the usual bonds are broken down, the usual rules are broken down, and it is, in that sense, again, a bit like Christmas, and with the famous idea that there's a topsy-turviness to this festival, with the usual social hierarchies being turned over. Now, I think all that's true up to a point. But I want to finish by saying, I think, as I hinted before, I think it's in some ways not quite as fun, or it wasn't always quite as fun as the usual slightly imaginative descriptions that modern authors tend to give you. I mean, I think for a start, most of you probably don't yet go to office parties, but I can tell you the office parties where the bosses serve the long-suffering staff, they are not always great occasions. That you've got this kind of sense that you look as if what you're doing is you're overturning the social order. The festival looks as if it's a liberatory festival. Actually, what it's doing in part is reminding you of how really strict the social order is. When the boss at the office party, cannot actually hand around the peanuts properly, what you are reminded of is that actually he is the boss. So it's a festival which looks in some ways as if it's letting it all hang out, but actually I think I'd probably rather Pliny going up to his study and getting on with his work than pretending to be a very good waiter at the slaves' table. So there's tensions built into the Saturnalia, like I expect there are tensions, we'd all say built into Christmas. More divorces happen at Christmas than at any other time of the year, and granny can be a terrible pain. And so there's that kind of familial and domestic anxieties coming to the fore too. But I think there's also political anxieties, and I want to end with just one example of where we almost get to see a Saturnalian party happening, and it's in the Roman palace. On Roman palace in 54 AD CE. It's in the first year of Nero's reign. Nero is a young teenage emperor, and as we all know, is probably about to go to the bad, but at this stage he's only just beginning. And we do have some descriptions of the Saturnalian do at Nero's palace in the first year. And another of the things that you did at the Saturnalia, you had a kind of forfeits game, and you chose a kind of carnival queen or a carnival king who was called the Rex Saturnalicius, the king of the Saturnalia. And the king of the Saturnalia is allowed to tell all the other guests at the parties to do something that will embarrass them and make them feel very stupid. And at the first Saturnalia of Nero's reign, who should draw the lot for being the king of the Saturnalia but Nero himself? So there's already a bit of a joke there that the real emperor is becoming the Saturnalian emperor too, right? So it's, the circle is squared. And one of the things we know is that Nero at that point is very anxious about his stepbrother Britannicus, because he thinks that his stepbrother Britannicus might be trying to oust him. So one of the things he does when he's Rex Saturnalicius is he picks on his stepbrother Britannicus to do a forfeit, to try to embarrass him. And he says to Britannicus, and you can imagine how this would go, I want you to sing a song, right? So this kid has to get up in front of everybody and sing a song, as embarrassing in 54 AD as it would be now. Britannicus gets up, but he's a clever little thing. And he sings a song which is actually a fable. And it's a fable more or less along the lines of the cuckoo always kicks out of the nest the real children of the mother bird. And everybody at the party sees that what Britannicus is saying is that Nero's the cuckoo, and he has pushed the rightful heir to the throne, Britannicus, out of the nest. And that is the start of the story after that Saturnalia, by which Britannicus is very soon going to end up being poisoned and being got rid of. So my final image of the Saturnalia is saying, look, it is great fun. There is the kind of paper hats, forfeits, all that, but actually it can very easily, and was, we know, be highly politicized and highly awkward in a way that goes beyond just the awkwardness of the office party. In the end, it was the Saturnalia that killed little Britannicus. Thank you.
That was a very powerful ending. Thank you both. That was really, really interesting. So we'll move to questions now. So if anyone has any questions, if you just drop them in the Q&A box. We already have a couple, so I'll kick off. One of the first ones is, why don't Greeks celebrate their birthday?
Haven't got the foggiest, really.
Probably didn't know when it was, Robin.
That's the most plausible thing.
I think they just don't. I mean, it takes a huge amount of bureaucratic efficiency to know when your birthday is.
Yeah, that might be right. But I mean, given that there are lots of festivals, So most months, the first 3 days of the month are always sacred to different gods. So if you're born on one of those days, your parents at least would know you'd been born on that day.
They've died, mate.
You can sort of, you're born 3 days before the beginning of the Panathenaea or during the Panathenaea, or so there are lots of landmarks where you could, in theory, I think, as it were, situate yourself in the year. So you don't necessarily need a sort of bureaucratic office that officially keeps your birthday in order for it to be known in the family when you were born. So it's a bit of a mystery to me. It can't quite be true either that people don't know anything, because there are various things which you have to be a particular age.
Yeah, no, that's right.
So you can't serve on the council till you're 30. You can't serve in a law court till you're 30. You can't serve in the assembly till you're 18. But it is interesting that the way in which you're recognised as 18 is by physical inspection.
Oh my God!
You parade in front of the council. And if you don't look old enough, they send you away and say, come back next year.
It's kind of nice. It is a nice contrast with Rome, because, of course, we know Romans have poems about celebrating people's birthdays in Rome, but also one of the most famous documents found in the fort of Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, going from the 2nd century CE, is the camp commandant's wife inviting a friend of hers from a nearby fort to come and celebrate her birthday. So we know that it wasn't just what rather posh poets got off on, that kind of relatively ordinary people were doing it too in Rome.
And just the other thing to say is the Panathenaea was held to be Athena's birthday. So it wasn't that you couldn't think that there were birthdays. Gods have birthdays, rather bizarrely.
Yeah, really interesting. So the next question, which I think, Mary, you kind of did touch on this a little bit, but it says, you both acquire such extensive knowledge on a very niche topic. Where did you learn this? And do you have any reading recommendations?
Blimey, by being old. But I think the difficulty about these festivals is in Rome, and I think it might be different in Athens, so Robin will say, but I think in Rome there is a huge tendency to try to get them sorted, get them organized. What happened at the Lupercalia? What happened at, name any of them. And if you want a book on that, which is as good as anything else, then Scollard's Festivals and Ceremonies or something of Rome or the Roman Republic would be a fine place to go. My problem with it is that it's terribly kind of join the dotsy. That the way people have approached these festivals is by they gather together every piece of information they can possibly find from any period at any time, and they try to sort it out and kind of, like in one of those join the dots puzzles, to kind of draw a picture of the festival on the basis of these little bits of information. And I think it probably gives you a very, very misleading account, just as you couldn't do it for Christmas. There are lots of people in this country who don't celebrate Christmas. We all celebrate it in different ways. Some people care not at all about the birth of Jesus Christ, but still have, like me, mangers, on their mantelpiece. So it kind of undermines the messiness. I think Roman festivals, and I would guess Greek festivals too, are really terribly messy. And I think where I get the niche knowledge, in a sense, it took me about 30 years to see the point that I've just made to you. I used to think that if you did bury yourself and you collected all the information you possibly could, you'd then be able to work it out. And I think my niche knowledge comes from eventually having nerved myself to stand apart from that and say, hey, come on, let's think what what is underlying this? Why is it difficult to understand? And also the knowledge that in Rome, at least, the Romans puzzled about it. The early Christians puzzled about what these things were. I mean, philosophers said, what is liberating about the Saturnalia? Now, and in a way, what I've got more and more interested in really is how people talk about them, rather than like the Nero example, rather than what actually happens. Because I think what actually happens is often just outside our grasp.
Yeah. And when we say something very similar, I think, on the Greek world, where we have a sort of combination of types of source. So all these villages in Athens did write up their own records in the sort of way of that decree that I showed you. And some of them at least wrote up calendars of what they did during the year in the way of festivals. And they write them up actually for slightly different purposes in slightly different circumstances. So some of them are obsessed with how much money you spend on them. So they carefully record how much the sort of monetary limits for what a magistrate can spend on these festivals. Others seem to be more interested in just getting clear who's responsible for what, and so on. So from some villages, we've got those sorts of calendars, and they tell us what month people do things in. But sometimes the sort of information that we end up having about a festival is like that information about the Haloa. So we don't really know what happened to the Haloa, but we do know exactly how much firewood they burnt. Now, and the other, by contrast, we then, from time to time, one of these festivals will catch the imagination of a writer, and tends to be a comic writer, who sees that they can, as it were, do something amusing with this, and we then get an essentially slightly parody account. And that has all the problems that comedy always has, which is how far is this making people laugh because it doesn't actually quite happen like that? And how far is it making people laugh because it happens just like that? Yeah. And so, we have to take this with a slight pinch of salt, and we have to be well aware that, and particularly something like the Rural Dionysia, which is being celebrated all over the place, they no doubt have their local ways of doing things. It has a broadly similar pattern, but actually that they do it differently. And so there isn't a sort of single place. In terms of what you go to read, then on all this stuff from Athens, you go to read Robert Parker, Polytheism and Society at Athens. Great book. He'll tell you about all the festivals very succinctly. He gives you a calendar at the back. So that's what you do.
In Rome, you would also, I think you'd be tempted to go to Ovid's calendar poem, the Fasti, which goes through just the first 6 months of the Roman calendar, and festival by festival. And it's often been thought of as, at least for the first 6 months, not for the Saturnalia, this is what is really, this is going to be the handbook. But in fact, Ovid, as always, is a bit like Robin's comedians. It's very clever, it's very interested in playing around with the myth, and it tells you precious little about what actually happened at the festival.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question is, when did the festival Dionysia stop, and why did it fade away?
Oh, good question, to which we don't know the answer, particularly not for the Rural Dionysia. We have a number of documents from the classical period which show it happening in various places, and it must have gone on into the Hellenistic period. There's not much doubt about that, but exactly when it stopped, we don't know. It almost certainly stopped at different points in different places. It looks as if village life in Athens became somewhat attenuated from the 3rd century BC onwards, we don't have these documents from individual villages after about 250 BC, and what it meant to belong to a village seems to have changed. The whole sort of the belly went out of community life, as it were, around Athens, which may have been partly about population reduction, partly about the greater attractions of life in town. But of course, it's very hard to discover evidence of absence. And so all you do is you just realize that you're not getting evidence of presence any longer. So we can't really answer that for the villages of Athens at all.
Okay. Okay, so I like this question. To what extent did the Romans adopt, for example, Celtic or other local practices around the empire for midwinter festivals, if at all?
I would have thought probably quite a lot, but it's very hard to pin that down. I mean, I think one of the things about Roman religious practice and experience outside Rome, like these ladies near Hadrian's Wall, is that they do intersect with and they adapt with what the local population is doing. Now we can see that very clearly in some, say, representations of gods, where you can see that there is in some ways there's a kind of amalgam. It's much harder to see that in terms of festivals. I think you might have a better chance of thinking about that in the Greek world than in the Celtic world. If you think, I would go to look at what Greek writers in the Roman Empire were talking about. But I think that the basic principle is that these things, in a way, like what Robin's saying, are very unfixed. There isn't a liturgy, you haven't got a service book, so it's changing all the time, and it's accommodating. It's actually Roman religion is, we have this image of it from what we think of as a conflict with Roman Christians, but actually by and large it's an extremely accommodating set of practices, and so you would expect that to be going on.
Yeah, and the next question is, do you think people would come to Rome for festivals, or you just don't know?
Hard to know. I mean, it is very clear that by and large, these festivals, not absolutely entirely, but are rooted to the geography of the city of Rome. They're rooted to a temple in the city of Rome, or a particular processional way in the city of Rome. And one of the best people in the last century to work on Greek and Roman religion, Simon Price, used to call it a religion of place, that it's the kind of exportation of this is impossible. Now, that means if you want to see these things, and some of them must have been extremely impressive, you would have to come to Rome. Whether it was a positive draw or not, I mean, I don't know of anybody who says, oh, I think we'll go to Rome to see the Saturnalia this year, darling, or even better, the Lupercalia. Let's go and see the Romans, take all their clothes off and rush through the city, beating the women with thongs. But it would have been difficult not to be impressed if you happened to be there, I think.
And we do know for the Rural Dionysia, and they seem not to have had a fixed date, so that you could go from village to village if you wanted to, and catch different festivals. So that implies that there are at least some people traveling around to get to go to things. And for other festivals, I think there's no doubt. I mean, the city Dionysia, there's no doubt that the people went into the city for that, or for the Panathenaea.
Yeah, so the next question is there a particular reason why the celebration of the Saturnalia was extended?
No, I mean, people treat it like with all Roman festivals. I mean, the idea that the number of theatrical performances in Rome increased, or whatever, it tends to get treated, I think, in a rather sort of sort of slightly unpleasantly reactionary way, is one of the ways the people got time off, and so, slightly like what I did with Christmas, saying, bloody hell, you don't go back to work till the 6th of January these days, don't they, talk about a long holiday. And that is how it tends to be talked about, even if that's only the undertext. That it is, of course, not necessarily for the Saturnalia, which is very domestic in what we know about it, but you can see the pressures to increase festival days in other particularly public theatrical things, because a lot of kudos goes to the people who are paying for the festival. And in a way, the more you pay, the more days you have. I mean, it's both grander. You can do and we know that Roman bigwigs were very keen on outdoing each other in how they bankrolled festivals, and length is one of them. So that happens very obviously in slightly uncomfortably in emperors and gladiatorial performances. I'm going to give you 100 days of gladiators. No, 150, etc. So there's a certain competitiveness, I think, but we don't actually know.
Yeah, fab. Okay, so why is December dedicated to Poseidon?
Not the foggiest.
Question.
It's a sort of phone a friend moment, but I don't think even my friends know why. And most of these months, or many of these months, the name derives from a festival within that month. But we don't know at Athens of a festival of Poseidon. Different Greek cities have different month names, but some of them are sort of adopted widely, and it may be that somewhere or other there was a festival of Poseidon in December, and the month had got named for those reasons. But no, we don't know.
I think that kind of illustrates something which is sort of been underlying some of the stuff we said, which is that we have come to take it for granted that there is a global calendar. There are some exceptions to that global calendar, but we can easily make equivalences. That whether it's the name of the month or a different start system. I think the thing that would be most confusing to us is that you fetch up in a different city in the ancient world and you don't know the timekeeping system. You have no idea what's going on. You don't even recognize the names of the months. You don't know how to count the days. And so that would have would have been a real problem going to Athens from, let's say, from Rome, and wondering if you could hit the Dionysia or not. Well, you wouldn't even know what month they were talking about.
Yeah, that is really interesting to think about. Okay, we're going to end with one last Christmassy kind of question. Would it be fair to say that Pliny the Younger is a sort of Scrooge character?
People's views on Pliny the Younger vary. Right? Some people think he's a complete well, I can't even say it on a webinar, who is, a killjoy, sort of a combination of boastful dutifulness, and, general sort of downer, right? And that the bit I quoted is a good example of Pliny being a downer. Oh, the staff, if they must make all this noise, I suppose I can put up with it just for one day, as it were. Other people who read Pliny's letters now are much more concerned to stress his irony, that he's having a joke on himself, that it's all very clever, in which case he might not be such a Scrooge as we take him to be. I don't know what Robin thinks about Pliny the Younger.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Mary. It's been really, really interesting to kind of do a deep dive into festivals. I think sometimes we don't really know a lot about them, so it's great to hear about that, and thank you for everyone on the call for putting in such great questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get round to your question, but feel free to email us and we can try and get back to you on those, but yeah, thank you for coming. and have a very Merry Christmas, everyone.
Thank you all.